Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tales of the Darkness. Lower the lights. Stay where you are. If something in your house feels slightly off tonight, don't check it yet. Just listen. Story 1. The closet door was not empty. My name is Ryan, and the moment my brother closed the front door behind him, the house felt like it noticed. Not in a dramatic way, not with a sound or a movement, but with a silence that didn't belong to an empty place. He was supposed to stay with me while our parents were out, but his phone kept buzzing, and every vibration pulled him closer to leaving. He said it would be quick, said nothing would happen, said I worried too much, and then he stepped outside and let the lock click shut. That sound stayed with me longer than it should have. I stood there for a second staring at the door, waiting for him to come back, but the house stayed still and I realized I was alone in it. I turned the television on louder than usual, not because I cared about the show, but because silence felt like attention. At first, everything seemed normal. The lights were on, the rooms looked the same, and the noise from the TV filled the space just enough to make the house feel occupied. But once you're alone long enough, you start noticing the sounds that were always there. The refrigerator humming too steadily, the vents breathing slowly, the floor making small adjustments under its own weight. Each noise by itself meant nothing, but together they felt like the house was clearing its throat. I checked my phone. No message from my brother. That absence felt heavier than any sound. I went to the kitchen to get a drink, moved carefully without realizing it, and when a cabinet hinge squeaked, my body reacted before my mind did. I laughed quietly at myself, but the laugh felt forced, like I needed proof that I was still the only person there. I went back to the living room and sat down, eyes on the screen, ears on everything else. That was when I heard the first sound from upstairs. It wasn't loud, it wasn't sudden, it was a short scrape, like something smooth dragged against paint, followed by a dull thud that stopped too cleanly. I muted the television immediately. The silence afterward felt deliberate. I listened, waiting for another sound that would explain the first, but nothing followed. I called my brother's name, not loudly, just enough to test the space, and my voice sounded thin as it traveled up the stairs. No answer came back. I told myself it was the house settling, that older houses make noises at night, that fear fills in gaps when you let it. Then I heard it again. The same scrape, closer this time, and beneath it a soft shift, like fabric moving when someone tries not to be noticed. My chest tightened because that sound had intention. I stood up slowly, every movement careful, and stared at the staircase like it might change shape if I looked long enough. The idea of staying downstairs felt wrong, but the idea of going up felt worse. I chose movement because stillness made the fear grow. Each step creaked under my weight, and every creak felt like an announcement. When I reached the top of the stairs, the air felt colder, heavier, like the second floor followed different rules. The hallway was dark except for the faint glow coming from my bedroom nightlight. That light made the darkness around it feel thicker, like it outlined everything it didn't touch. I stood there listening and heard nothing except the house breathing, slow and patient. Then I heard it again, coming from my room. A quiet sound, controlled, the kind of sound someone makes when they shift their weight carefully. My bedroom door was slightly open. I knew I had closed it earlier. I pushed it open with my fingertips and it moved smoothly, without resistance, like it had been left that way on purpose. The room looked normal at first glance. Bed, desk, clothes on the chair, nothing disturbed. Then I saw the closet door. It was open by an inch, just enough to be wrong. I stared at that narrow gap and felt my heart beating hard enough to pulse in my ears. I reached for the desk lamp and turned it on quickly, like light could force the room to tell the truth. The room stayed quiet. I stepped closer to the closet and noticed a faint smell that didn't belong there, something stale and sour, like sweat trapped in fabric. I grabbed the closet handle and pulled it open fast because slow felt like giving something time to react. Inside were my clothes, boxes, shoes, all where they should be. For a second my body tried to relax. Then the hanging shirts pressed outward slightly, not swinging, not reacting to air, but shifting as if something behind them had leaned back. I stumbled away and hit the bed frame, my eyes locked on the closet. The movement stopped instantly. The space behind the clothes looked deeper than it should have been, darker, like a narrow pocket someone could hide in. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and the vibration sent a jolt through me. It was a message from my brother telling me to stop bothering him. Seeing it made me angry for a moment, but the anger vanished when I heard another faint cloth sound from the closet. I backed out of the room without turning my head too much and moved down the stairs fast, no longer trying to be quiet. I called my parents with shaking hands and told them someone was upstairs. My mother's voice went sharp and clear as she told me to lock myself in the bathroom and call the police. I did exactly that. I locked the bathroom door and sat on the floor, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my mother breathe on the other end. Then I heard footsteps upstairs, slow, heavy, controlled. They crossed the hallway and paused at the top of the stairs, like whoever it was wanted to listen first. The footsteps started down, one step at a time, and I stared at the gap beneath the bathroom door, waiting for a shadow that didn't come. When the steps reached the bottom, the house went silent again. That silence felt worse than movement. My mother kept telling me help was coming. I tried to breathe quietly. Then the bathroom doorknob turned slowly, not rattling, not forcing, just testing the lock. It stopped, then turned again, even slower. I could hear breathing on the other side of the door, close and patient. Minutes later, pounding hit the front door, and voices filled the house. Police moved through the rooms quickly. They found a back door unlocked, a kitchen window forced just enough to reach inside, and muddy footprints near the stairs. They didn't find the person. They said the intruder must have run. I nodded because it was easier. Later, when my father checked my room with me, the closet door was closed. When he opened it, the clothes were pressed inward, and behind the storage bins in the back corner was a neatly folded blanket that didn't belong to us, placed flat like a bed. If you want more stories like these, subscribe to Tales of Darkness. Story 2. He was someone we knew. My name is Caleb, and what still makes this hard to explain is that the man who came into our house wasn't a stranger, wasn't someone hiding in the dark or forcing a door. He was someone my family already trusted enough to recognize his face. I was young enough that night still felt long, the kind of long where every sound matters, and that night my parents were gone, not far, just out. Trusting that the house was safe because my grandfather was asleep in the back room, and because the neighborhood had always been quiet. I remember sitting on the floor of the living room with toys spread around me, the television low, not because I was scared, but because I liked hearing the house breathe around me. It was late enough, that the windows reflected the inside instead of the street, and that reflection made the room feel closed in, like the house had turned inward. The knock on the door came suddenly, not loud, not desperate, just firm enough to demand attention, and I remember looking toward it with confusion instead of fear, because people didn't knock at that hour unless they belonged. I didn't answer it right away, because I had been taught to wait, to listen, and while I waited, I heard a voice from the other side, a familiar voice slurred just enough to sound wrong. It was our neighbor, a man who waved at us, who talked too much when he drank, who laughed loudly and always called me by the wrong name. And hearing him say my mother's name made my stomach tighten because it sounded careless, like he wasn't thinking about who might be listening. He said he needed help, that something had happened, that he couldn't get home, and even then it didn't sound like an emergency. It sounded like inconvenience, and that detail mattered later. I stood up slowly and walked toward the door, telling him through the wood that my parents weren't home, and he laughed softly like that didn't matter. He said he just needed to come inside for a minute, just to sit down, just to catch his breath, and I remember how many times he said just, like the word could make the moment smaller. I should have gone to wake my grandfather, but the idea of waking him felt like trouble, and trouble felt heavier than the situation itself. I unlocked the door and opened it a few inches, enough to see his face, and his eyes were unfocused, glassy, fixed on something behind me instead of on me. The smell of alcohol hit me immediately, thick and sour, and when he leaned closer, the door creaked under the pressure. He smiled at me in a way that didn't reach his eyes and asked if he could come in, and when I hesitated, he laughed again and pushed the door open wider with his shoulder. I stepped back automatically, not because he forced his way in, but because my body understood something my mind hadn't caught up with yet. He walked inside like he had been invited, shoes on, heavy steps, moving through the living room with confidence that didn't belong to him, and he shut the door behind him without asking. The click of the lock felt loud enough to echo. He looked around like he was checking the place, then looked down at me and smiled again, and that smile made my chest feel tight because it was too relaxed, too patient. He asked where my parents were, and when I told him they were out, he nodded slowly, like he had expected that answer. He said he needed a drink of water, and I pointed toward the kitchen, and he followed me, his steps uneven but purposeful. When we reached the counter, he leaned against it and watched me instead of the sink, and I felt the weight of his gaze like pressure on my back. I turned on the faucet and filled a glass, and when I handed it to him, our fingers brushed, and his hand was colder than it should have been. He drank slowly, staring over the rim, and then he set the glass down harder than necessary, the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen. He asked if anyone else was home, and when I said my grandfather was asleep, his mouth tightened just slightly, like the answer complicated something. He laughed it off and said that was fine, that he wouldn't be long, and then his eyes drifted to the drawer where my parents kept the knives. I followed his gaze before I could stop myself, and the moment our eyes met again, his smile faded. He reached out and opened the drawer, slow and deliberate, like he wanted me to see every movement, and he wrapped his fingers around the handle of a large kitchen knife. The metal sliding against the drawer made a sound that didn't belong in a normal house. My body went cold. He didn't raise the knife, didn't point it, didn't threaten me. He just held it loosely at his side, like it was something he always carried. He told me not to be scared, and the calm way he said it made everything worse. He said he was just feeling confused, that he needed to sit down, that things were hard, and while he talked, he took a step closer. I backed away without thinking, my heart pounding so hard it hurt, and I called out for my grandfather, my voice breaking on the first try. The man's head snapped toward the hallway, and his expression changed, not to panic, but to irritation. He told me to be quiet, told me not to wake him, and when I didn't listen, he took another step forward, knife still low, still casual. My grandfather's door opened at the end of the hall, and the sound of it felt like air rushing into a sealed room. My grandfather stood there in his robe, confused, squinting at the scene like his eyes hadn't caught up with his ears yet. He took in the man, the knife, my face, and something hardened in his posture instantly. He demanded to know what was happening, his voice sharp and awake now, and the man turned toward him with a crooked smile, lifting the knife slightly like it was an explanation. He started talking fast, words tumbling over each other, saying he was just visiting, just needed help, just having a bad night, and my grandfather didn't let him finish. He told him to put the knife down and leave, and the authority in his voice filled the room in a way I had never heard before. For a moment, nothing happened. The man looked between us, his grip tightening on the handle, and I remember thinking that this was the moment where everything could go wrong, where the story would turn into something else entirely. Then, without warning, he laughed, a short, humorless sound, and dropped the knife onto the counter. He raised his hand slightly like it was all a misunderstanding and started backing toward the door, still talking, still smiling, apologizing in a way that didn't sound sincere. My grandfather followed him, keeping his body between the man and me, and when the door opened, the cold night air rushed in. The man stepped outside, turned back once, and looked directly at me, his eyes clearer now, focused, and that look made my stomach twist because it felt like recognition, not regret. My grandfather slammed the door and locked it, then stood there breathing hard, his hands shaking just slightly. He didn't say anything at first. He walked back to the kitchen, picked up the knife, and put it back in the drawer like restoring order could erase what had happened. He told me to sit down, that everything was fine now, but his voice didn't sound convinced. My parents came home later, and the police came with them, and statements were taken, and the man was found at his house passed out, and they told us he was drunk, that he didn't remember much, that it was a misunderstanding. But what still keeps me awake isn't the knife or the alcohol. It's the way he closed the door behind him when he came in, like he already knew he wasn't planning to leave quietly. Story 3. He asked to stay. My name is Jordan, and the reason this story still feels unfinished is because nothing technically happened. Nothing crossed the line far enough to become a crime. And yet I know with absolute certainty that if I had made one different decision that night, I would not be the one telling it. I was 16, old enough to think I understood people, young enough to still confuse familiarity with safety. My parents were gone for the weekend, trusting me with the house because I had never given them a reason not to, and that trust made me careless in ways I didn't recognize until much later. The night started quietly, the way normal nights do, music low, lights on, phone in my hand, boredom stretching time thin. Around midnight I got a message from a friend named Marcus, someone I knew from school, not close, but familiar enough that his name didn't raise alarms. He said he was nearby, that he had nowhere to go, that his parents had kicked him out after an argument, and that he just needed a place to stay for the night. The message wasn't dramatic. It wasn't desperate, and that was part of what made it convincing. I hesitated, not because I felt danger, but because I felt inconvenience, and that detail matters because it shows how wrong my priorities were. I asked where he was, and he sent his location, close enough that it made saying no feel rude. I told him he could come over, but that he couldn't stay long, and he replied with a simple thanks that felt too quick, like he had already decided before asking. When he knocked on the door, I didn't look through the window first. I just opened it, and he stood there with his hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched, eyes tired, looking smaller than I remembered. He thanked me again and stepped inside without waiting to be invited further, and I noticed how his eyes moved, scanning the house in a way that felt practiced. I told myself he was just curious, that everyone looks around when they enter a new place, but that explanation didn't sit right even then. We went to the living room and sat on opposite ends of the couch, the television on, but neither of us really watching it. He talked about his parents, about how they didn't understand him, about how everyone always expected the worst from him, and while he spoke, his hands never stopped moving, fingers rubbing together, tapping his knees, tracing the seams of his jeans like he couldn't settle. I tried to keep the conversation light, asked him about school, about music, about anything that would keep the air normal, and he answered, but his answers were short, unfinished, like his attention was split. At some point, he asked if anyone else was home, and when I said no, he nodded slowly and didn't say anything else for a moment, and that silence felt heavier than his talking. He asked if he could use the bathroom, and I pointed down the hall, and when he walked away, I realized I was listening to his footsteps, counting them without meaning to. The bathroom door closed, and the lock clicked, and that sound stood out because it felt unnecessary. Minutes passed, then more minutes, and the television kept playing, and I found myself staring at the hallway instead of the screen. When he finally came back, his expression had changed, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed, his jaw tighter, his eyes more focused. He sat back down, closer this time, and asked if my parents really wouldn't be back until the next day. I told him yes, and I remember the way he exhaled through his nose like that answer settled something. He said he was hungry, asked if there was food, and I went to the kitchen because moving away felt safer than sitting there. While I opened the fridge, I heard a drawer open behind me, then close, and when I turned around, he was standing in the doorway watching me, his hands empty, his expression neutral. I asked what he needed, and he said nothing, just looking. I handed him something to eat, and he took it without thanks, chewing slowly, eyes never leaving me. He asked if I had any weapons in the house, and when I laughed it off, he didn't smile. He just said he was curious. That was the moment my stomach tightened because curiosity was the wrong word for the way he said it. I told him he couldn't stay the night after all, that my parents would be home soon, and the lie came easily because fear sharpens language. He stared at me for a long second, then shrugged like it didn't matter, like the night was flexible. He said he would leave after he finished eating, and he did, slowly, deliberately, like time was something he could stretch. While he ate, he asked questions that didn't seem connected, about where I slept, which doors were usually locked, how loud the house was at night, and every answer I gave felt like a mistake as soon as it left my mouth. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was letting stereotypes and rumors fill the gaps, but my body didn't agree. When he finally stood up, he didn't go toward the door right away. He walked down the hallway, stopping near the kitchen, near the bathroom, near my bedroom, looking inside each space like he was memorizing them. I followed him at a distance, my heart pounding, and when I told him again that he needed to go, his expression hardened just slightly. He said he thought I was different, that he thought I understood him, and that sentence made my skin crawl because it felt like blame. He stepped closer, not touching me, just closing the space enough that I could smell him, and I realized then how alone I really was. I told him my parents were already on their way, and this time the lie sounded more convincing because my voice shook. He studied my face, then nodded slowly, like he was deciding whether it was worth the risk. Without another word, he turned and walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped outside. He stood on the porch for a second, looking back at me, his face unreadable. Then he smiled, not friendly, not angry, just knowing. He told me to lock the door behind him, and the way he said it felt like an instruction, not advice. I did it immediately. I locked every door, every window, turned off the lights, and sat on my bed listening to the house until my parents came home the next morning. Nothing happened after that. No calls, no messages, no confrontation. But weeks later I saw him at school, and he smiled at me the same way, and I understood that the worst part wasn't what he did, it was how close he came without ever having to try. Story 4, he was standing there. My name is Lucas, and this is the one story I never tell out loud because saying it makes it feel real again, like the house might remember it too. I was young enough that bedtime meant rules, lights out, door closed, and my parents believed that routine was protection. That night my mother tucked me in, my father checked the locks, and the house settled into the familiar quiet that comes after adults decide nothing else can happen. I lay in bed listening to the distant sounds of the house, the pipes clicking, the walls shifting, the kind of noises that usually fade once sleep takes over. I remember staring at the glow of the nightlight on my wall, tracing shapes with my eyes, letting my thoughts drift until something interrupted the pattern. I heard my name, not loud, not urgent, just a soft voice saying it once, like a test. I froze because the voice came from inside my room. I held my breath and listened, convinced I had imagined it. And for a moment there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the house. Then the voice said my name again, closer this time, clearer, like whoever was speaking knew exactly how far away they were. I whispered for my parents, my voice barely working, and when no one answered, I felt the first edge of panic cut through me. I told myself it had to be my imagination, a dream starting before I was asleep, but my eyes were open and my body was awake, and the room felt different, like the air had thickened. I slowly turned my head toward the foot of my bed, and that was when I saw the shape by the window. At first, it looked like a shadow stretched too tall, standing where the curtain didn't quite reach the floor. I watched it carefully, waiting for it to move with the sway of the fabric, but it didn't. It stood still, solid, darker than the darkness around it, and I understood immediately that it wasn't part of the room. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might make noise. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, convinced that when I opened them the shape would be gone, but when I looked again it was still there, closer now, just a step away from the end of my bed. I could see the outline of shoulders, the suggestion of a head, and the space where a face should have been felt empty, like it absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. I tried to scream, but my throat locked, and the sound came out as a breath instead of a voice. The figure shifted its weight, and the floor creaked softly beneath it, a real sound, a sound that belonged to the house, and that made everything worse because it meant it wasn't just something in my head. It said my name again, and this time I realized it was copying my mother's voice, not perfectly, but close enough that it felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I shook my head, whispered no, pulled the blanket up to my chin like fabric could protect me, and the figure took another step forward. It was close enough now that I could smell something faint, like damp clothes and cold air, and that detail anchored the fear in my body. I squeezed my eyes shut again, tears building, and I told myself that if I stayed still long enough it would lose interest. The silence stretched, and I almost believed it had worked, until I felt the mattress sink slightly near my feet. The pressure was gentle, careful, like someone testing how much weight it could put down without waking someone. I opened my eyes and saw the blanket pressed down where the shape leaned, and I knew then that it wasn't leaving. I finally screamed, loud and uncontrolled, the sound tearing out of me, and the figure reacted instantly. It stepped back, not startled, but alert, like it had been waiting for that sound. The door to my room opened behind it, flooding the space with hallway light, and my father rushed in, flipping on the overhead light without slowing down. The room filled with brightness, and the shape by my bed was gone. My father grabbed me, held me tight, asking what happened, asking where it was, and I couldn't answer because I didn't know how to explain something that disappeared the moment light touched it. My parents searched the room, the hallway, the house, checked windows, doors, closets, everything, and found nothing out of place. They told me it was a nightmare, that I had been dreaming with my eyes open, that fear can make things feel real, and I wanted to believe them because believing meant I could sleep again. They stayed with me until I calmed down, then left the light on and closed the door most of the way, promising nothing could get in. I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, afraid to look toward the window again, listening to the house settle back into silence. Just before I finally drifted off, I heard my name one last time, not from the room, but from the hallway, spoken softly in my mother's voice, even though I knew she was asleep. The next morning, my parents found muddy footprints outside my window, pressed into the ground beneath it, spaced like someone had been standing there for a long time, close enough to watch me sleep. Closing Tales of the Darkness. That's it for tonight's stories on Tales of the Darkness. If you're still here, it means the silence in your room has started to feel heavy. That's the signal. That's when the walls start watching back. Get one thing straight. These stories don't just stop when the screen goes black. They stay behind. They hide in the corners of rooms you think are safe. They follow the routines you trust blindly. They're the answers to the questions you're too scared to ask out loud. So tonight, stay sharp. Watch out for those pauses that feel a little too helpful. Watch out for the people who answer you way too fast. Watch out for the moments that fix themselves before you even move a finger, because someone is always one step ahead. If you want more of this, hit that subscribe button right now. New stories are dropping all the time, and trust me, they don't ask for permission to enter. Sleep with one eye open, or don't. It won't matter anyway. Good night.